Dan. About 6 months ago, I posted a video called Producing Records in the 80s, which was fun. It was fun both to make that and to do it. It was a great time. I really enjoyed working as a record producer more than anything. I got a lot of comments, favorable comments on that video, and one viewer who has a screen name Ostendia wrote to a couple of weeks ago and say, "Hi Bill, is it possible to post a video where you can tell us what the differences are when you made a track from scratch back in the day and a track made from scratch nowadays?" That's an interesting question, and I've thought about that a lot because I've lived both both times, then and now, so I'm in a good place to answer that. He also, also by this, tell us how you made music back in the day using click tracks, minimizing sync problems, using CV gate, that's control voltage, early MIDI interfaces for the Commodore 64, home computers, etc. Thanks in advance. That's it. He's looking for some very technological answers. And I'll give them to the extent that I can remember them. But the bigger notion of building a track from scratch back in the 80s and doing it now is an interesting question, and I've pondered that many times as I'm building a track from scratch these days. I think about what it was like then. And the quick answer is that there was practically no difference, that we did it pretty much the same then as I do it now. I'm speaking just for myself. I'm not talking, everybody records things in their different ways. But by the time I started making records in the early 80s, what I was doing was just starting to become mainstream, and that is to build a track in layers, as Ostendia said, to start from scratch, rather than record a whole group live in the studio, or even a whole rhythm section in the studio, which I did that as well. But I'm pretty sure what Ostendia is asking about is starting from scratch, doing all the parts yourself. And that was a thing that was just starting to come into vogue, and it was it'd been 10 years, I think, since Stevie did Superstition. I just still amazed when I heard Bob Margoulev in an interview talk about how they recorded Superstition, because Stevie sat down at the drums without a click track, had the song in his head, and just by himself on drums laid down Superstition, all the fills, everything. He had the form of the song in his head, and his head only, and used his own internal click track, which is mighty and awesome. But that was starting from scratch in 1972. And back then, to play all the instruments yourself, you had to play drums, because the drum machines were pretty weak, and you wouldn't want to leave them on a finished track. When I came along, we had the LM1, Roger Lynn called it the drum computer, and that was the only computer in the studio when I recorded the Wolf album, because its sequencer handled the timing and the auto correction of the parts were quantized to usually 16th notes or 8th note triplets, depending on the tune. And then you chain them together and off you'd go. But everything else before MIDI was played by hand, and that's an important distinction. So you had to be very careful to be as precise as you could be. And for what I was trying to do with pop and R&B and funk, there wasn't any room for sloppiness. You had to be what they call in the pocket. You got to keep no rushing, not behind. You got to be in the groove.
2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Rushing or dragging?
Rushing.
So you do know the difference.
When MIDI came along, that changed the game entirely. And then it got, at times, it would get too robotic and too sterile because you could autocorrect everything. And people did. Maybe not the best choice. But I do remember Oberheim had a digital sequencer. Of course, the first sequencer that I worked with was the ARP sequencer, and I made a video about that. That's what how I got to know Stevie Wonder, and how I got to wind up working with him for 3 years. And it was that ARP 1601 sequencer that had 16 steps, and it had a lot of functions. It could do a lot of cool things. And then Oberheim invented a digital sequencer that I think could hold 64 notes, but you couldn't sync it to anything. So you set the speed of it and off it goes. So it was kind of difficult to use. Larry Dunn had one, and he used it with Earth, Wind, and Fire. It was always kind of hit and miss when they played that song live, whether it would, you know, he had like a 30-second note thing that would be impossible to play. And it was a cool effect, but sometimes live it didn't quite sync up because there wasn't any way to sync that thing. But then when MIDI came out, it changed everything. The impact was huge, and synthesizers that did not have MIDI were instantly shunned, and everybody was selling off all their non-MIDI instruments to buy the new hotness. That and the DX7 were a huge game change. But the first MIDI sequencer that I ever had was made by Sequential Circuits, which coincidentally Dave Smith was one of the main inventors of the MIDI protocol. MIDI, musical instrument digital interface, was developed in conjunction with I forget, a Japanese guy. I think he worked for Roland. But it had to have the cooperation of all the manufacturers, or it's not going to work. Because the whole idea was to have a protocol where synthesizers, drum machines, all of that stuff could talk to each other and communicate. And it was like open source software today, and it was quite a feat that they pulled it off. But it was good for everyone, you know. And for music making, it was very cool. But that first Commodore 64 sequencer was from Sequential Circuits, and the MIDI interface was built into it. It was like a game cartridge, and it plugged into the cartridge slot, and then it had MIDI in and out ports on it. And it was buggy. It would crash if you just looked at it wrong. And I got into the habit of record a note and save, you know. I mean, it was like record 2 chords and then save. You just frantically saved to make sure that you didn't lose what you were working on. But it worked. Flaky. Prior to that, as far as syncing was concerned, we were using the sync function of the LM1 drum machine, which you just record its sync tone onto track 24 of your 24 track, and it worked flawlessly. And the LM1, I think, was based on a Z80 microprocessor, and Roger Lynn just did a great job because everything that was supposed to work did work, and it wasn't lacking. But I think the sync code in the LM1 was proprietary, and we started using for sync. We got a Roland SPX80 sync box, and rather than use the proprietary drum code from the LM1, we would lay down a SMPTE track, which anything could sync up to then. And we used the SPX80 for that. And sync wasn't an issue, because SMPTE, again, was a protocol that was adopted by everybody. And when the Apple Macintosh came out, sequencers started to appear for it. There was Digital Performer, and the one that I used was by Opcode. It was called Vision, and that thing was tremendous. It was so cool. I loved that. I used to call it a Swiss Army knife of MIDI sequencers. And it had, I still haven't seen another sequencer as good. It had, each sequence file had 26 subsequences. Later they called those segments, and that was, they corresponded to letters on the Mac keyboard, A through Z. So you could have a different part of your tune in that you could play back, and you could chain them together just by, pressing. You know that the bridge is B, and then this is that, and then it was really versatile and very, very cool. So basically, the answer to the question was we would start out a track. First goes down the time code, and then the drums. And you're layering. You're going one part at a time. And one difference between what we did back then and what I do now is that we recorded the drums of the LM1 on separate tracks, because the LM1 had separate outputs for each drum, and we used those. So we would have sometimes 10 tracks just devoted to the LM1. You can process them just like you would real drums. You can put a compressor on the kick and have a different echo on the snare and EQ everything differently and pan them how you want. You have complete control because you're recording them on separate tracks. So the layering, you would build it up. You put down the drums, and then usually I'd put down piano part, the main keyboard part. And then you could hear where it was going, and then the bass part, definitely. Whether or not I had intended to have a bass player come in later, I'd have that bass down just to work with it. And then guitars, real or fake, and you just building it up a track at a time. And that Billie Jean was recorded the same way. I wasn't in the room with Louis Johnson and Dugu. It was just, and I don't think they were in the room with each other. In fact, I'm sure they weren't. That track again started out with the drum machine, and I'm pretty sure that when I recorded my part on Billie Jean, it was just, there was a bass track down there, but it wasn't a finished bass. So it was a scratch mini Moog bass part, and I think the drum machine. And then I'm in Studio B of Westlake with Matt Forger and doing my, boop, 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 boop thing. So it was all built in layers back then. So it was the way I'm doing here at home in my home studio. What has changed these days is the sheer amount of things I can do with the home studio it's bonkers. I could take any of the tracks that I make here and output stems that can be imported completely into any recording studio anywhere, and it'd be completely professional and there's no degradation. Whereas back when I was recording in a home studio back in the day, I just had the little 4-track, the 4-track cassette, which didn't sound that great. But now you can have just at home. It doesn't matter if you're I'm using Ableton Live because it's the closest that I've found to Vision, because I use the scenes like those subsequences in Vision, because it helps me to arrange a piece of music, because I can break it down into specific chunks and then listen to one played back after another and go, oh, what if I had this happen there? It helps enormously with the arranging process. But all the DAWs that we have now, whether it's Ableton or Logic or Pro Tools, they're all extremely advanced, and you can exchange tracks with all over the world. So the tools are nuts. The plugins are highly advanced. I use software synthesizers more than I do the hardware ones, because they've just gotten so good, and it's easy. So those are the things. The things different is technologically, what I have here far surpasses what I had in the 80s. Like I said, when I first started with the Wolf album, everything had to be played by hand. And then when we got into sequencers, you could hear it on a lot of those 80s records where everything is quantized, and it gets a little bit stiff and it's a little bit robotic, because everybody, how could you not resist that? It was later you had to figure out how, this is starting to sound like a machine, and I don't want that. I want a more human feel. And people started to rethink how they're using the quantizing. But it got the capability to do everything. But what's changed, and this is the ironic part, is in the meantime, the record business went away. It became the streaming business. And we get paid in micro payments, bupkis, 0.03 of a penny for a stream, and it's ludicrous. Anyway, I don't know if it's psychological or maybe not, but I mean, partly is when I'm working here in my home studio, I feel like I'm making a demo, and maybe that's because I'm not in a $100 an hour studio. That's one of the differences. When we would build a track from scratch back in the day, we're going into one of the top studios in LA or New York, wherever you were. You're going into a 24-track studio that's charging like $100 an hour, plus probably $25 an hour at least for the engineer. You're paying for 2-inch tape that costs $100 a reel or more, and you're only going to fit about 3 songs on each reel. When I went into Alan's Dance Recording to record the Wolf album, I was prepared for every session. I knew what I was going to try to accomplish that day. Wasn't any kind of thing where you hear about, oh, we're going to write the album in the studio. I didn't have that kind of luxury. I had a small budget, and I used it the best that I could. But serious as a heart attack about it, and went for quality. Like we recorded the drums on separate tracks. I don't do that with the stuff I do here. I record the drums. All the drum plugins I use have separate outputs, and I could, but I don't, because I'm like, in my mind, it's like I'm making a demo. I'm not putting the full effort into it that I did back in the day. And you're making a album that's going to be on a major label, and there's going to be a whole team of people promoting it, hopefully, and their jobs are on the line. Whether you're going to get a chance to make another record is on the line, and everybody took that stuff serious as a heart attack. And everybody that I knew, that I ran around with, and all my colleagues and all the people that I knew, when they were in the studio, they did not fool around. There was not wild partying. It was business, and you worked. And you did the very best that you could, and you gave it everything. I mean, the other thing that I don't take as seriously in doing my stuff here at home is mixing. We'd take a whole day just to mix one song. I'd leave the studio and let the engineer have at it, and then he'd let me know when he was ready for me to hear it. And then I'd give him notes. I'd say, yeah, needed a little this, that, and the other. And I'd go away and let him do another one at it. The other thing, though, that I don't do a whole lot of. I do it in the video editing program when I transfer what I've recorded into it, is mastering. It's your last chance to tweak it. We would go to a mastering studio, and I had the best mastering engineers in the business. I had Alan Zentz himself, and then I had Brian Gardner and Chris Bellman, and those guys, except for Alan, who sadly passed away, but the other two guys are still working, and you've heard their work, believe me. So the mixing and the mastering, you took all that much more seriously. I did. So that's different. I put more care into it back then, and I don't these days, and I don't think I'm the only one, because I see a lot of people online forums that say, like, yeah, I started a track, but I just can't get motivated to finish it. It's like, well, yeah, why? Because what's it going to be? You're going to put it on Spotify and hope somebody hears it. Or you put it on YouTube, and it's just one more grain of sand on this vast beach. We've got 8 billion people on the planet now, and they're all creating content, it seems. They're not all making videos. Some of them are making music. A lot of them are making music. It's a different world. Anyway, that's enough of that. I hope I answered your question. I hope this was interesting. And I'll see you next time. Arrivederci. Ciao. Sayonara. Auf Wiedersehen.